If Patton hadn't acted when he did, the 101st Airborne wouldn't have been captured or forced to lay down their arms. They would have been erased from the battlefield. December 1944. The Screaming Eagles sat trapped inside Bastogne, cut off on every side, ammunition down to a whisper, medical kits long spent, and German armor grinding toward them through the snow. Hitler had ordered their destruction outright. And with the skies shut by relentless storms, no Allied aircraft could get through. No supplies. No cover. No rescue. No one, except one commander, refused to accept that this was how the story would end. This moment marked the point when Eisenhower understood that Patton might be the only general capable of prying open a miracle. 4 days. That was the estimate for how long the 101st could hold before everything collapsed. December 19th found the Supreme Headquarters Situation Room thick with tension. Officers delivered reports in low, steady voices, each worse than the last. German forces had smashed deep into the Ardennes, carving a massive breach across the front. But the most alarming update centered on a Belgian crossroads town almost no one had cared about a week earlier, Bastogne. More than 10,000 American troops, primarily the 101st Airborne with attached units, were encircled. Outnumbered nearly 3-1. Running out of everything. And with aircraft grounded by the brutal weather, even their last lifeline had been cut. Eisenhower studied the map, fatigue etched across his face. Reports landed one after another, riflemen counting their final rounds, artillery nearly silent, wounded men being housed wherever there was shelter from the cold, enemy pressure rising by the hour. "What's their endurance?" he asked. The answer came with reluctance: 4 or 5 days, maybe a week if luck held. After that, the position would fall. Losing an entire airborne division wasn't just a tactical blow. It would shatter morale across the Allied armies. These were the paratroopers of D-Day and Market Garden, men whose reputation carried weight far beyond the battlefield. When Eisenhower demanded options for relief, the truth was grim. Montgomery's forces were locked down in the north. Other American divisions were already stretched to breaking. No one had the mobility or the position to strike quickly enough. No one except the Third Army, fighting 100 miles to the south under George S. Patton. Eisenhower had spent years navigating Patton's genius and volatility, his brilliance and his flare-ups. But now, staring at the encirclement on the map, one conclusion became impossible to avoid: Patton might be the only man who could pull off a maneuver bold enough, and fast enough, to save Bastogne. "Get Patton," Eisenhower ordered. "Have him in Verdun tomorrow. And tell him to bring plans for offensive action." As the room emptied, Eisenhower lingered. His aide would later recall hearing him murmur a quiet plea to the empty space. "George, do this right. Those boys are depending on you." The conference the next day at Verdun later became legend, mostly for Patton's astonishing promise. Less remembered is Eisenhower's reaction, and the weight of the decision he carried. Eisenhower opened the meeting with determination, insisting the crisis could be turned to advantage. But every officer present understood they were facing the gravest moment since D-Day. When he asked how soon a relief strike toward Bastogne could be launched, the room filled with calculations: fuel, roads, brigades, weather. Then Patton spoke. He could attack on the 22nd with 3 full divisions. The room fell still. To pull forces out of active combat, pivot them north, drive them more than 100 miles through winter storms, and hit the enemy within 72 hours bordered on the impossible. Eisenhower stared at him, searching for certainty beneath the bravado. With deliberate calm, he asked the only question that mattered. "George, I'm not asking for wishful thinking. I want to know what you can truly deliver." The fate of 10,000 Americans hinged on Patton's reply. The 101st Airborne was trapped, vastly outnumbered, and bleeding through its final scraps of ammunition. If Patton committed to a date and failed to appear, the division wouldn't simply lose. They would cease to exist. Eisenhower asked again, slower this time, every word weighted: could he strike on December 22nd? Patton didn't blink. My staff has already drawn up 3 separate plans. We anticipated this. We've run the scenarios. On the 22nd, the 4th Armored Division will drive north toward Bastogne. I'm not making a prediction, I'm stating a certainty. Eisenhower searched his face, expecting showmanship or bluster. Instead, he saw something far more unsettling: absolute confidence. Patton truly had prepared for this moment before he walked through the door. Even Eisenhower couldn't hide his admiration. Very well, George. Bastogne is your mission. You have full authority to act as needed. Then his voice shifted to a low, controlled warning rarely heard by anyone outside his inner circle. But hear me clearly. If you miss that date, if the paratroopers fall because you overpromised, I will remove you from command. Not just the Third Army, your career will be finished. Do you understand? Perfectly, sir, Patton answered. And I won't fail. After the conference, Eisenhower pulled General Walter Bedell Smith aside. Smith later noted in his diary that Eisenhower asked whether Patton could genuinely achieve what he had claimed. Smith admitted it seemed beyond reach. Eisenhower nodded once. That, he said, is exactly why Patton is the one I'm sending. He's built for the impossible. December 20th to 25th, 1944. As Patton's army began its massive pivot northward, Eisenhower entered the most harrowing week of his command. Updates from Bastogne arrived around the clock, each darker than the last. December 21st. German guns hammered the defenses nonstop. Casualties rose sharply. The Germans demanded the 101st surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe sent back his famous single-word reply. Nuts! Eisenhower read it, and allowed himself a rare smile. Their spirits intact, he murmured. December 22nd. Patton hit the Germans as promised, but the advance ground forward painfully. Ice, snow, and entrenched tanks slowed every mile. Inside Bastogne, ammunition was so scarce that some men carried only a handful of rounds. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Wounded soldiers were dying simply because nothing was left to treat them with. Eisenhower sent a message urging McAuliffe to hold, no matter the cost. But in his private journal he confessed, I approved Patton's plan because there was no other option. Now every hour I wait is another hour men die. If George can't reach them, I bear the blame. December 23rd. The sky finally cracked open. Transport planes dropped food, bandages, and ammunition, just enough to keep the defenders alive. German pressure intensified immediately afterward. Streets devolved into close-quarters fighting. Intelligence warned of a coming, decisive German assault. Eisenhower sent a terse order to Patton. Push harder. The 101st cannot endure much longer. December 24th, Christmas Eve. Eisenhower spent the night at his desk. Officers noticed he looked years older than he had only days earlier. Third Army was still miles from Bastogne. Believing he might soon face the unthinkable, Eisenhower began drafting condolence letters. To the family of McAuliffe, to officers he had spoken with, to soldiers' parents. His aide found him surrounded by unfinished pages. Eisenhower looked up and said quietly, I pray these stay unsent. December 25th, Christmas Day. No breakthrough. Eisenhower attended chapel but heard none of it. He kept slipping out to check incoming messages. Nothing. Bastogne remained surrounded. Patton was still fighting uphill. The window was closing. December 26, 1944, 4:50 p.m. The phone rang. Eisenhower's aide picked up, listened, then turned pale. Sir? General Patton is on the line. He says it's urgent. Eisenhower seized the receiver. Patton said. We're through. The 4th Armored made contact with the 101st at 1650 hours. The passage is narrow, but it's open. Supplies and reinforcements are already moving in. Bastogne is relieved. For a moment Eisenhower couldn't speak. His grip tightened until his knuckles whitened. His staff watched the exhaustion melt from his features. George, repeat that. We're inside Bastogne. The screaming eagles held on. They're beat up, but alive. We reached them in time. When Eisenhower finally found his voice, it cracked with emotion. "George, thank God." "Thank you? You saved them," Patton replied in his usual clipped manner. "Just doing the job. The boys in Bastogne are the ones who did the hard part. We only opened the door." Eisenhower shook his head. "No, George. You turned an entire army 90 degrees in a blizzard and shattered German lines in 4 days. That isn't routine. That's—" He stopped, searching. "That's why you're indispensable." When the call ended, Eisenhower stood completely still. When Eisenhower finally turned back to the men in the room, witnesses later recalled the same detail. His eyes were shining, and he made no attempt to hide it. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "General Patton has just carried out an operation I will never forget. 10,000 Americans were on the edge of destruction, minutes from being wiped out. He reached them in time. He delivered exactly when the situation demanded it, even when every calculation said it could not be done." He paused, gathering himself. "Patton is, without question, the most challenging subordinate I have ever commanded," he continued. "But he is also one of the greatest combat leaders this nation has ever produced." Eisenhower immediately issued formal communications, commendations to the 101st for their extraordinary defense, thanks to Third Army for breaking through, an official report to Washington confirming Bastogne's relief. But he also sent something far more personal, a private telegram straight to Patton. "George, there are no words strong enough to convey my admiration for what Third Army achieved. You gave your word you would reach Bastogne. You kept that promise. In doing so, you preserved not only the lives of 10,000 men, but potentially the entire outcome of the Ardennes battle. Well done is far too small a phrase. This operation will be analyzed for generations as a model of military mastery. I am proud to have you under my command. Ike." Later that evening, Eisenhower's aide found him alone, studying the map where the narrow corridor into Bastogne was still marked in pencil. Eisenhower didn't look up. "4 hours," he murmured. "That's all George had to spare. 4 hours between rescue and disaster." In the days that followed, and in the years beyond, Eisenhower's reflections on Patton shifted from immediate relief to the long view of history, shaping how the world would remember the two men. December 27, 1944. Eisenhower issued an official announcement. "The liberation of Bastogne by units of General Patton's Third Army is one of the outstanding accomplishments of this conflict. The speed of the maneuver, the flawless coordination required to disengage from active operations, pivot north, and attack through brutal winter weather and determined enemy resistance demonstrates the highest level of operational art. The defenders of Bastogne, and those who fought to reach them, have written a new chapter in American military history." But in private communications, Eisenhower spoke with less ceremony. To General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. "Patton has saved my entire command. Had Bastogne fallen, with an airborne division annihilated, the psychological shock would have been crippling. Doubts would have been raised about our strategy, about our army, about my leadership. Patton prevented all of it. Whatever difficulties he's caused, and there have been many, this success justifies every decision to keep him in the field." To Field Marshal Montgomery. "Patton's breakthrough at Bastogne represents American operational capacity at its finest. I know there have been concerns about our effectiveness. Bastogne should dispel them." And in his own diary, Eisenhower wrote the thoughts he rarely voiced aloud. "I have spent years wrestling with Patton's temper, his impulsiveness, his tendency to push boundaries. I have considered relieving him more than once. And yet Bastogne has settled the matter. He is worth every argument, every sleepless night. Because when the moment came and 10,000 men stood on the brink, he acted without hesitation. He delivered precisely what he promised, exactly when he promised it. That is the measure of a great commander." On January 2, 1945, Eisenhower sent Patton a final message, this one reflective, almost philosophical. "George, with time to look back on Bastogne, I see that what you achieved goes far beyond tactical success. You gave hope to soldiers who had none left. You demonstrated that American forces could carry out immensely difficult maneuvers under conditions no planner would ever ask for. You reshaped German perceptions of our capability. Most importantly, you saved lives, not in theory but in fact. Every paratrooper who eventually returned home owes part of that to your speed and audacity. Medals and promotions pale next to that legacy. I wanted you to know it. Ike. Years later, in Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower devoted an entire section to Bastogne. Patton's march to relieve the town stands among the decisive operations of the war. The rapid movement of multiple divisions, the level of coordination required, and the aggressive execution under appalling conditions displayed the very best of American command. Historians may debate many things about the war, but Bastogne's relief stands beyond debate. It was an act of operational brilliance. In a 1964 interview, just 2 years before his death, Eisenhower was asked to name the toughest command decision he had ever faced. Without hesitation, he spoke of the moment he entrusted George Patton with the task of reaching the surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne. "It was a decision that cost me every ounce of certainty," he recalled. "I was putting everything on the line, the lives of 10,000 men, the stability of our entire front, in the hands of a general who was brilliant, but notoriously hard to manage. And yet, he knew, no one else could pull it off." When the message came that the corridor had been opened and the paratroopers were finally reached, Eisenhower admitted to feeling a relief and gratitude beyond words. Those 4 simple words, "We're through to Bastogne," might have been the most significant he heard during the entire war. In his final assessment, written in 1965, Eisenhower reflected on what history should remember. Many generals would be celebrated from World War II, but few could claim to have saved an entire division from annihilation through sheer operational brilliance. That was George Patton at Bastogne. Difficult, controversial, flawed, yes, but also the man who refused to accept that those soldiers were doomed. He promised he would save them, and he did. The relief of Bastogne was more than a military operation. It was the moment Eisenhower realized that genius, however complicated to manage, was worth every frustration when it delivered miracles. If stories of impossible odds, desperate decisions, and words that shaped legends inspire you, subscribe to this channel. We bring you the untold moments, the private thoughts, and the human drama behind history's greatest battles. Hit the notification bell, leave a comment about leadership under pressure, and share this with anyone who needs a reminder of what's possible when someone refuses to accept defeat. Sometimes, the hardest people to manage are the ones who achieve the most extraordinary things.